You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR Radiothon 2025. Your station, your voice.
For the month of June, we're asking listeners to donate to the station to help keep us going. We rely on the generous donations of the community to survive. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate and show your support for community-owned and community-run media.
Well, here we are. Anarchist World this week. Got a few minutes before we switch across to the Community Radio Network. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank all those people who donated to the 3CR Radiothon, courtesy of the Anarchist World this week. The grand total so far, we were asked to raise $11,700. Our total is $12,202.62. I don't know what the 62 cents is doing there. It's really annoying me. So you can always ring up and donate 38 cents during the program. 94198377. Ask for Lou. But 12,202, which is a few $100s above what we were expected to raise. So thank you very much. I'd like to make a special mention of Johnny Latte and Luigi, who've been raising money for during the whole year for the to donate to 3CR, courtesy of the Anarchist World this week. They actually raised an extraordinary amount of $3,000. So thank you to everybody who donated. Hopefully those of you who require a tax deduction will get your legal legitimate tax deduction. You can be like the Stokes and Reinhardts and Packers of Australia. You can be proud that you have used Australia's corporate-friendly taxation laws to ensure that your taxes keep 3CR on air. Congratulations. And those of you who don't pay income tax, tough cheddar. But you've got a nice heart and you've got a warm inner glow. So hopefully over the next few months I'll be able to organise a new poster for the Anarchist World this week, and we'll send it out to all those people who donated to the Anarchist World this week. Now, if you live south of the Yarra, I know people think nobody lives south of the Yarra. They've forgotten that 70% of Melbourne's population is south of the Yarra. Tonight is the last Wednesday of the month. We'll be having a dinner at Frankston, beginning at 6:30 p.m. at La Porquetta's in Frankston. Join us for the Pepsi Public Interest Before Corporate Interest dinner. And if you live north of Frankston, don't forget on the second Wednesday we meet in Brunswick at the restaurant there. What was it? It's Garuda's, whatever it's called. So I'll tell you more about it. But the thing is, tonight is Frankston. So come along. Now, I've also understand there will be a protest outside the Housing and Fairness Office at 50 Lonsdale Street at midday on Tuesday. So if you can't come to that, please come to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests rallies, or which we have on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House every Thursday from midday to 1 p.m. So we'll see you there tomorrow. And obviously, it's followed by lunch. Everything we organised is followed by a communal gathering where you pay your own way. Let's move on. So there's lots of things happening in the world today. We'll discuss them. Well, we'll give an opinion about them on the Anarchist World this week. Once again, I'd like to thank all those people who've supported 3CR through the Radiothon, irrespective of what program you actually supported. The important thing is it means 3CR will be on air for another year. Of the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Any complaints? That's your problem, not mine. But if you want to talk to me, leave a message on 0439 395 489. If you wonder what anarchy is all about, no, not what's happening in the Middle East and the rest of the world. Anarchos means without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to send bombers in to bomb other places in preemptive strikes? Well, it's inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve or share power through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Very simple ideas. Nothing radical about them. Exceptionally simple ideas. Now, well, once again, we're seeing what happens when individuals or small cliques have unlimited power. And whether we give them that power through a parliamentary election or whether they're self-appointed dictators is irrelevant. The fact is, the centralisation of power is the single most important element that we need to look at when we need to understand what's happening around us. Now, it was interesting, wasn't it, seeing Israel, the Pariah state's big brother, give it a lending hand. Here we've got this odious theocracy in Iran, and we've got this odious elected government in the USA, and we've got this odious mass murderers in Israel, right? And here they are trading bombs. And who are the major people who suffer? Civilians. End of story. Extraordinary, isn't it? So here we have the Israeli state. The Israeli state and its current democratically elected government involved in some of the most heinous crimes we have seen in the 21st century. And nothing highlights this more than the atrocities, the daily atrocities that are occurring in Gaza, an enclave of 2 million people. That's right, an enclave of 2 million people in an area half the size of Sydney and half the size of Melbourne. Total blockade for almost 20 years, and over the last 20 months, an extraordinary level of barbarism which continues as I speak. As people who are starving are shot dead by Israeli troops, those really, really, really courageous Israeli troops who couldn't even defend their own country when Palestinians broke out of Gaza. Here we are, indiscriminately shooting Palestinians, lining up to get a box of food for their families. If you look at the pictures coming out of Gaza, we are seeing a landscape that looks like a collection of Stone Age rubble. And people are expected to live in this situation. At the same time, we have continuous bombing by those courageous people in the Israeli Defence Forces in their attempt to eradicate what they describe as a terrorist organisation, Hamas, and which the Australian government describes as a terrorist organisation. Now, the thing about this pariah state, and that's all it is, I mean, you may call Iran a pariah state, Russia a pariah state, but Israel is the king of the pariah states in terms of the atrocities which are occurring. Now, it's interesting to see that the buffoon, the President of the United States of America, is beginning to realise that the Israeli government has been playing him like a fiddle. Now, although we are told that the stealth bombers obliterated the Iran's nuclear program, the reality is they wouldn't have, because it would be deep in that mountain. And I think that's one thing that this exchange, which was initiated by Israel, on the hope and a prayer that the United States would come in and finish the job for them, because they are incapable of finishing that job. They're very good at bombing, countries. They bomb Syria, they bomb Lebanon, they bomb Yemen, they bomb Iran, you name it, they bomb it. Somehow thinking that this is the way to secure security for 10 million people living amongst another 800 million in that region. And as I said consistently on this program, the greatest recruiters for Hamas, the greatest recruiters for the oppressive theocracy in Iran is the Israeli government and the Israeli Defence Forces and the policies which they have been pursuing, courtesy of the almost unanimous support from the United States of America. It is interesting to see that the President of the United States of America was so pissed off with Israel that he dropped the F-bomb. Here he is, he's crafted this ceasefire, and all of a sudden people are beginning to rain on his parade. Now, if the United States President is really interested in being remembered as a peacemaker, because remember the gentleman is nearly 80, he's just had his 79th birthday, and, being a septuagenarian, the body seizes up as you get older. If he wants to be remembered as a peacemaker, now is the time for the United States to put pressure, which we saw they were able to exercise over Israel because they are its major armaments supplier, to stop the carnage in Gaza. They can do it tomorrow. That's all I have to say. Not much else I can say. It's obvious. Performance war. It's almost like a performance in a theatre. But again, it's real. Real people are killed. People going about their day-to-day affairs. People not interested in the odious regime in Iran or the tyrannical regime in Israel. But it's real. The suffering is real. Almost 60,000 civilians, 70% women and children, murdered, and that's the key word. They're not collateral damage, they're murdered human beings in Gaza. The destruction of essential infrastructure, the destruction of a community with the aim of forcing people out into Egypt so they can reclaim Gaza. The atrocities that are occurring in the West Bank. It's as if the Palestinians don't matter. They don't exist. All I can say is keep up the discussion with your friends and family. Things are beginning to move in the direction of the Palestinians. To end that suffering, we need to maintain that pressure. It's no use slapping each other on the back and saying, oh, well, isn't it great? We've knocked out the Iranians' nuclear capacity. The fact is, it hasn't been knocked out. It's still there. And eventually, the Iranian theocracy, that odious government in Iran, will do what the odious government in North Korea did. Develop nuclear weapons, because that is the only way they are able to survive. I'll give you another example. We talk about a rules-based order. We talk about international law. We talk about treaties. The fact is, what we've seen, what we continue to see around the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's what's happening internally in the United States of America, what's happening, in the Middle East, right is might, or might is right. When it comes to the so-called pariah states, they're expected to obey the rule of law, to expect international law, all this stuff. But when it comes to the West, our allies, or Australia's allies, not your allies, Australia's allies, well, we can do whatever we bloody well like. Preemptive strikes, massive civilian casualties, removal of basic rights. but with a media which doesn't even look below the surface, which moves from story to story to story to story, there is really no understanding of the depth of the depravity that we face every day. Now, you're saying to me, well, Joe, what's this got to do with Australia? It's in the Middle East. I know there are people in Israel and Iran who are Australian citizens who are visiting relatives who are living there who want to come back to Australia, and fair enough. But what's it got to do with Australia? Well, get ready. Get ready to sacrifice your children and grandchildren on the altar of so-called security. Because what it has to do with Australia is a lot of things. Because although we find ourselves at the edge of this dispute, because the current government is not willing, obviously, to give support, right? Give support. The current government is not willing to give support. But again, it's not willing to not give support. The fact is that we have become nothing more than an outpost for, guess what? The US military. So I'm interested in knowing what role did Pine Gap and other US bases in Australia play in terms of the Middle Eastern crisis and the US stealth bombers. Why are we seeing more and more United States troops, up to 3,000 now in North Australia on a rotation? Why is our military capability totally dependent on the US industrial military complex, where we don't actually even have the power to use certain military assets because of the agreements we have made with the United States government? For example, when Australia wanted to send its old tanks to Ukraine to assist the Ukraine resistance, it took over a year for that to occur because of resistance from the US military-industrial complex. I mean, we live in a totally integrated military situation. Now, our geographical isolation was our saving grace as a nation-state. As we rattle the sabres of war and beat the drums of war regarding China and Taiwan, if something occurs in our side of the world, or the side of the world Australia finds itself in, we will be totally integrated into that response as the United States' primary ally in this part of the world. And as we've seen in Lebanon and Israel and Qatar and the rest of the Middle East, the type of technology that is available to sovereign nation states to destroy and degrade their neighbours' capacity to defend themselves is no longer dependent on our geographical isolation. Now, when the Iranian government sent a few missiles towards a US military base in Qatar, and obviously warned the US that the missiles were coming so they could be shot down, it was about saying to the US government, well, we can reach your encampments in the Middle East. And it's the same here in Australia. If you think you live in Sydney or Darwin or Melbourne and you're immune to being a victim to a preemptive strike or a victim in case of, even a limited military engagement between the US and China, well, then you're living in cloud cuckoo land. We are now at the front line. And bases like Pine Gap and other US secret military bases in this country make us a prime target, because these bases are used to coordinate attacks around the world. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. See, the thing is, people think, oh, well, I'm totally powerless. Well, we're not powerless yet in this country. We do have a so-called representative democracy. It is susceptible to pressure. And people are beginning to question this hanging on to the United States coattails. As I've said on numerous occasions, our security is dependent on our relationship with the sovereign nation states around us. Whether we like it or not, that's the reality of the 21st century. It's not dependent on a US alliance. Let's move on. Public housing, everybody's business. Now, I'm going to go through this again and again and again because it's becoming a significant issue which very few people want to address. Now, I've been involved in this struggle for over a decade, and I want to go through it piece by piece by piece, because this is one area of Australian politics and Australian, infrastructure which has been totally clouded over. Yeah, it's a terrible word, isn't it? Clouded over, but people don't understand. Let's start from the beginning. Public housing is publicly owned and owned in Australia by the state governments who are responsible for housing. Obviously, there is federal assistance, but public housing is owned and managed by state governments. Now, I'm more familiar with the Victorian situation. Now, we have had public housing in Victoria since the end of World War II. And the impetus to creating a strong public housing sector was the fact that when returned servicemen and women from World War II, and let's not forget over 25,000 Australians were killed in that battle against fascism, many found themselves homeless, living in tent cities in the MCG and the Botanic Gardens. If you're one of these people that plays with the net, have a look at the pictures. This was the impetus. And governments took on the responsibility of providing housing for their residents and citizens. And the public housing sector expanded in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And by the 70s, about 15% of Victorians were living in public housing. Today, in 2025, it's less than 3%. I think it's possibly 2%. Now, what is the advantage of public housing? Well, it's got two major advantages. One, rents are fixed at 25% of income. And public housing wasn't introduced just for people in desperate situations, which it seems to be the policy today. Well, they don't even get public housing. I'll go to that in a minute. Public housing was introduced to ensure that anybody who couldn't afford to buy a home in the private sector was able to have a roof over their heads, courtesy of the state government. And the rent was 25% of income. So if you're on some type of social security benefit, then your rent was 25% of income. And if you're on a low wage, your rent was 25% of income. Unlike private rental, where rents are 30, 40, 50, even 60% of income. Now, public housing played a significant role in the marketplace in terms of keeping a lid on real estate prices in the private sector. The greater number of public houses, the less need for people to buy into the private sector, which means there is competition between a public and private sector, and private sector prices tend to be much lower because of market forces. When you drastically reduce the number of public houses, what happens is that the amount of competition in the marketplace decreases, and with a little bit of assistance from government, through taxation advantages through negative gearing, we see an explosion in housing prices, which is what we see today, where in some areas like Sydney, the average price the mean price for a home is over $1 million. Well, 40 years ago it would have been $50,000. And when you think that wages have increased sevenfold over the last 40 years and houses have increased 40-fold, you begin to understand why we have a situation. Now, I'm going to use the P word. I know it's an unpleasant word, but privatisation. What we have seen in Victoria, and Victoria is at the forefront of the battle to privatise public housing, to allow the state government the opportunity to wash its hands of the responsibility it has to the people living in the state to provide secure housing. And that's the other thing I didn't mention, security. Public housing provides you with security. And I could show you many examples of people who've lived in public housing for decades, raised their children, and their children have been able, to have that security of knowing they're not going to be moved on. Because it doesn't matter how much, money you have and you pay for rent, at the end of a lease, you can be moved on for the most spurious of reasons. But in public housing, unless you're a real dead shit, you've got security of tenure.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
So what is the brilliant government's, and I'm talking about state governments and federal governments, policy regarding housing? Well, we are going to privatise public housing, but we need to make it sound palatable. I think my palate couldn't get around that, could it? Palatable to the general public. So let's use some fancy, nice, warm words like social housing, community housing, affordable housing. What animal could be against these institutions? What beautiful words. Community, social, affordable. Wonderful words. But there's only one problem. Community housing, social housing, affordable housing is privately owned housing, privately managed housing. And as people that have been forced out of the towers in Melbourne CBD, which are going to be supposedly redeveloped, the 45 towers, are finding themselves, they've got all the security. It may be a difficult situation because of the concentration of people with issues in a small area, but you've got security of tenure, you've got security of knowing that your rent is 25%. You move from public housing, you're told, well, we're going to move you from public housing, we'll put you into community housing. Community housing is privately owned. It may be owned by a not-for-profit group, it may be owned by a nice charity, but at the end of the day, they need to meet their financial commitments. So that what that means is the percentage that residents pay of their income to find themselves in this type of housing can be up to 30%, sometimes 35%. It also means they lose that security of tenure, because these privately owned corporations, which are funded by the state government and guaranteed by the state government in terms of their entry into this sector of the economy, what it means is that all you've done is you've shut down a sector of the economy as far as housing is concerned, which is publicly owned and publicly managed, and moved it into the private sector. So there is a significant difference between social, community and affordable housing. And today we've got this ludicrous situation of the federal government and state governments around the country thinking that the way forward regarding housing security is not by increasing public housing stock, but decreasing public housing stock and increasing private housing stock. And the more private housing stock you have, the less competition in the sector. It's a little bit like the financial institutions. When the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, the other banks and the Commonwealth Bank were able to charge whatever they liked, and they continue to charge whatever they like, irrespective of government policy. So public housing is everybody's business. If you are interested in this struggle, I encourage you to look at the Defend and Extend Public Housing Facebook page, or Public Housing Everybody's Business Facebook page, and you can join us on vigils in the steps of the Victorian Parliament House every Thursday, midday to 1 p.m. And if you want a little bit of direct action, on Tuesday the 1st of July, there will be a protest outside the entrance of the Minister of Housing and Fairness offices in 50 Lonsdale Street in Melbourne. See, public housing is everybody's business. We shouldn't think of it as just housing for people in dire situations. It's much, much more than that. It's about the state intervening in the marketplace to ensure that everybody, especially wage earners and people on social security benefits, have access to housing. It's not about increasing rent assistance. It's not about more community affordable social housing. It's about going back to a system that provided the services necessary. For example, after a while, people realised that building huge metropolises of people with similar issues could be detrimental. It's not detrimental in all situations, but in some situations. So the Victorian government in the 80s and 90s, especially the 80s, embarked on a spot purchasing program. What's a spot purchasing program? Well, I'm familiar with many people living in spot purchased public housing. The state bought a house, bought a unit in a nondescript suburb, somewhere in Melbourne, somewhere in regional Victoria, and then placed families in it. Now those families became integrated into that community. And that's what it's about. It's about integrating society. It's ensuring that different sectors of society interact with them, interact with each other. That's the issue. That's the way you create community. Let's move on. As I said, you listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Look, I'd just like once again to thank all those people who donated to the 3CR Radiothon. Community radio station 3CR is the station from which Anarchist World This Week is broadcast. The Anarchist World This Week is, I think, raised around $12,200.62. I don't know what the 62 cents is there. That's above what we were expected to raise. So thank you very much for that. And it's great to see that there are people out there who still value community radio. I've noticed that the SBS is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Let's not forget at the same time that SBS was created. The community radio networks and community radio stations around this country were created by the much maligned Whitlam-led Labor government to ensure that people who had no access to the corporate-owned media or the government guild at ABC actually had a mechanism via which to influence community. And almost 50 years later, it's great to be part of this public radio. Irrespective of the number of podcasts that are produced, and let's not forget, the Annex World this week is podcast. You can access it by going to 3cr.org.au. The fact is that we are able to broadcast over a wide region across Australia through various community radio stations. This gives us the ability to give another point of view, not an alternative point of view, but another point of view about what's happening in the world today. Now, I'll give you an example. Here's a good example. Right. Now, look, if you're not into unpleasant things, I suggest you turn off for a few minutes. Australians lick his ass, Venetians kick his ass. You like that? What am I talking about? Have I gone mad? Australians lick his ass, Venetians kick his ass. Now, currently, the big debate in the Australian trade union movement, what's left of the Australian trade union movement, is whether, that's right, is whether Amazon, Jeff Bezos' baby, is to be allowed to tender for projects in the Australian federal government projects. And they were here a few, I think last week or the week before, when we were bending over backwards going, oh, isn't this wonderful? The Prime Minister was there slapping this, this multi-billionaire, exploits his workers on the back saying, oh, what a good bloke he is. He's going to build a factory here. We're going to have iCloud, blah, 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 blah. Kissed his ass and bowed and kowtowed and went on. Now, this same gentleman, Mr. Bezos, I can't even pronounce his name. I'm not that particularly interested in his name. But he's getting married in Venice. Be nice to get married in Venice, wouldn't it? Gondoliers. Guess what? What's left of the residents of Venice were up in arms. They couldn't believe it. Here he is, a man who pays minimal taxation legally, especially in Australia. A man who's made his fortune by exploiting his workers. A man who refuses to allow his workers, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers across the country, to be unionised. He's having a grand, knees up, Mother Brown wedding in central Venice. Now, see, Venetians aren't like we, all right? They don't lick ass. They've been pushed around for decades. And what's happened is many of the original inhabitants have been forced out of the city into other islands, then come in, to work during the day and then leave Venice to sleep at night. So there is a history of resistance, community resistance in Venice, not just among the people that are left, but among many of the people who have been forced to the outer islands because of the tourist trade. And they were disgusted when they realised their city was going to be turned into some Disneyland. So some billionaire, and his partner were going to be married there. And we were going to see billionaires coming in their private jets. I understand 90 private jets to bring 200 people to this wedding to end all weddings. And through their determined opposition, we have now seen that this wedding will take place in a little private kind of venue in Venice where they can draw up the drawbridges to keep the rabble out. So, a great victory for direct action. It may not be a great victory in terms of the world, but for the Venetians, what is highlighted to the rest of us, that is a determined group. can actually stare government in the face, can stare the billionaires in the face, and can, through direct action, change the trajectory of history. So this is, I know it's a little bit funny, but it is a classical example of what people can do when they get together, stick together, work together for a common aim. This is what people can do. So if a few thousand people that are still left in Venice can do this, why do we have to kowtow to Amazon? Why do we have to allow them to tender for contracts which are put out by the Australian government on our behalf, knowing full well that the workers who work for them basically are on a minimum wage and are grossly exploited, while those who make a buck from them legally pay minimal taxation. Think about it. Think about it. Think about it. Congratulations to those small group in Venice that was able to, ensure that they have some control about what happens in their city. Unlike here in Australia, where we're happy to lick their ass for a buck. But that's the way it goes, doesn't it? Let's move on. What a price we pay. What am I talking about? Well, we've seen a Australian Labor Party a victory. They smashed the opposition, although they only got 1/3 of the vote. I mean, the preferences helped them over the line. They smashed the opposition. I think they have 94 seats in a 150-seat parliament in the House of Representatives. And with the help of what's left of the Australian Greens in the Senate, they can pass extraordinary levels of legislation. Now let's compare the Albanese-led Labor Party with the Whitlam-led Labor Party. This is its second term in office. They have an overwhelming majority, overwhelming support by the Australian people who rejected the negative policies of the Dutton-led Liberal Party and the National Party. They got their arse, if we're going to talk about arse again, basically kicked. And I understand the opposition leader, as I speak, Susan Lee, will be doing a little thing at the Australian Press Club, which obviously you and I will never get invited to tell us how they got their arse kicked. So, what happens? Where are we going? Let's look at the Whitlam-led Labor government. Let's look at it. I mean, this is, if you listen to conservative, reactionary commentators, and obviously Fox News is full of that garbage, it was the worst government in Australian history. It was just terrible. It was horrible. We all suffered. Well, I lived through that period. I was very happy. Didn't have to go to Vietnam. Free education. The establishment of a community radio station. The establishment of no-fault divorce. Social security benefits for single mothers. The establishment of the greatest institution since the creation of pensions post-World War II. Medibank, and now it's called Medicare. Something that people kind of think is great because it's there and assists them with their public health costs, especially in an era with an ageing population, with multiple comorbidities who are, need to deal with this, deal with their health issues. Law reform, the introduction of legal aid centres, law reform, all done within 4.5 years. Also a push to limit US involvement in Australia. People are talking about closing down Pine Gap, and the list goes on and on. A huge list of reforms. And the fact is, although it was kicked out of office by the Governor-General, the man who, how shall I put it, liked his drink. Not that there's anything wrong with liking your drink, but when you govern the general, you do need to show a bit of decorum, especially if you go to the Melbourne Cup races. But that's a different story. So here we have this government, 4.5 years in power, extraordinary amount of reforms, and we are still benefiting. We continue to benefit as a people, each and every one of us, from those reforms. Now we have the Albanese-led Labor government. Much better position than the Whitlam-led Labor government ever was in. Much better position. So what are they talking about? As I spoke about last week, they're talking about increasing productivity. They're talking about giving the Jeff Bezos of the world access to government contract. They're talking about continuing, or not only talking about, passing legislation to ensure that Woodside continues to extract gas from the Northwest Shelf, for another 50 years. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Where are the big ticket items? Where's the change? Where's the discussion about a universal basic income? Where's the discussion of increasing the revenue base and not relying solely, almost solely, over 70% on income tax revenue? Where's the debate about significant tax reform that looks at negative gearing and the fact that you get a tax deduction for owning shares in this country, or the fact that you can have up to $3 million in your superannuation fund, and make hay? Think about it. Where's all this discussion? How about the public housing debate? I mean, here we have poor Mr. Albanese telling us he was a public housing brat, all right? And look where he is now. Prime Minister, nice house somewhere on the south coast of New South Wales, nice superannuation pile waiting. Nothing wrong with that. Happy for him to enjoy his life. But isn't it now the time to actually do something? Actually do something to benefit the Australian public, to increase taxation revenue, looking at things like a 1% stock market tax, a 1% financial turnover tax, and the list goes on and on. Isn't it time to take on the corporate sector in an era where the Murdoch media is no longer the single arbitrator of what is good policy and bad policy, although the hacks that are in Fox News, total hacks, those hacks really are living in the 18th century. Now's the time to move forward. It's not the time to sit on your laurels. It's the time to introduce significant reforms. The Australian Greens would be happy to support those reforms in the Senate. There is no hold-up in the Senate to reforms. There is no hold-up in the Senate to passage of legislation. 94 out of 150. Even if not one crossbencher, and I think there's 12 of them, could be 11, maybe 15, I've forgotten. Even if not one crossbencher votes for the Liberal National Party. Now is the time for reforms. 3 years. We could have a large public housing sector. We could see the removal. Now, obviously, those people who benefit the most from this country's taxation-friendly laws, they are the ones that will be jumping up and down and crying. Remember all the tears from all those people with more than $3 million in their superannuation funds. Well, you can have less than $3 million in your superannuation fund and you can invest your money in something else. What an extraordinary situation. This is a golden opportunity. I'm not talking about revolution. I'm not even talking about nationalising this country's resources. Simple reforms which can be put through with a parliamentary majority. Who cares how the Fox medias of the world react? Who cares how conservative and reactionary forces react? Now is the time for action. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. But no. Good Ship Australia, we're on a steady as she goes course, aren't we? All right. Over 32,000 registered charities. We've got all these wonderful charities. You know, I've got nothing against charities, but sometimes I think, well, maybe we don't need them. We don't need them. We need charities when governments don't do their jobs. It's that simple. Now, I know I talk about this every week, but it just brings tears to my eyes. And I mean, I've been around a long time and I've seen a lot of things, and very little brings tears to my eyes. But when I see or hear an Australian charity raising money to send Australian kids to public schools, I feel a knot in my stomach. I think to myself, how have we as a people, as a nation, as a sovereign nation state, reached this situation where private charities have to step in to assist people? When I hear that young students who've graduated are saddled with a HECS debt for years, if not decades, and let's not forget, those that are saddled with the HECS debt are not those that have rich parents, because the rich parents pay for the degree up front. It's only those who can't afford it, his parents can't afford it, have a HECS debt. It's the same with the bank of mum and dad as far as your housing is concerned. 1/3 of new home buyers rely on money from their parents. Now, if your parents are on a social security benefits, if your parents are on a minimum wage, or even a $100,000 a year, which seems a lot, but these days isn't much, you will find that they're not in a position to help you. Not because they don't love you, but because they're just not in that financial position. And then we have a superannuation system where the more money you have in your life, the greater your superannuation benefits. Isn't that extraordinary? It should be the other way around, shouldn't it? The less you earn, the greater should be your superannuation contributions by government to ensure you don't have to rely on a government pension at the end of your life. And that's the beauty of a universal basic income. But this is Australia. This is the Australian Labor Party under Mr Albanese, a man who seems to be bereft of any ideas apart from pandering to the corporate and private sector. Here we go. Good Ship Australia, steady as she goes. Steady as she goes. Attached to the back of a US carrier, steady as she goes, hoping somehow that we will be protected. Unbelievable. What else can I say? What else can I say? I mean, look, you know this, I know this. How can 28 million people living on a continent, not some bloody little island somewhere, not in Gaza, not in the West Bank, not in Iran, but 8 million people living on a continent, have so many so-called insoluble problems? 1/3 of the population lives on a social security benefit, which is just enough, if you're lucky, just enough to meet your financial commitments. 70% pay extraordinary amounts of income tax. The less you earn, it looks like the more you pay under the new taxation regime in this country. That's 70%. People talk about 3 million Australians out of 28 million, that's about 10%, going hungry during the month. This isn't Gaza. We're not being bombed every day. We're not being denied access to medical facilities because, you've got a Medicare system, a pharmaceutical benefit system. So why have we allowed this to happen? Well, we've allowed this to happen because we've been dazzled. That's right, dazzled by mammon, dazzled by the almighty dollar, somehow thinking that privatisation and globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation would deliver us the goods. Well, unfortunately, it hasn't delivered you the goods, hasn't delivered me the goods, but it has delivered the goods to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who continue, despite a significant Labor Party majority in the House of Representatives, and a willing Senate to pass any reforms by the lower house to dictate parliamentary policy and the parliamentary agenda. That is the issue. That is the issue we face every day when we allow a minuscule minority to dominate economic activity in this country. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. If you want to have a discussion, a chat, I don't do discussions, 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. If you're a virtual warrior, you've got a few websites, anarchistmedia.org, public interests before corporate interests. Yes, you can join today, right now, on the web. You can join public interest before corporate interests right now. Facebook pages, Joseph Toscano, YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interests, josephtoscano.com. I could go on and on. Facebook pages, you name it. We're out there in the virtual world. But unfortunately, the virtual world doesn't create change. All it creates is the potential for change. Save your forefinger from the repetitive strain injury of saying like in the virtual world. Come back to the real world. Join people who are involved in direct action and protests across this country, whether it's this situation in Palestine, whether it's poverty, whether it's public housing, whether it's inequality. Get out of that tower, get out of your armchair and assist those people. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, The Anarchist World on your local community radio station, courtesy of those very nice people at the Community Radio Network. It's a pleasure to be able to broadcast across this country to so many people around the globe. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Listen in next week to The Anarchist World this week. Here we go.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.